Good evening, Lake Orion. Welcome to History Now here on ONTV. I'm your host, Anthony Taormina. And this week I want to talk about something that is very, very interesting. As a boat person, and it's always good to see a lot of lighthouses. Lighthouses are still in port today. There are lighthouses throughout the world. You've got lighthouses in the United States. You got lighthouses in Spain, and throughout the Atlantic, throughout the Pacific. You've got them in the Great Lakes. You've got them on certain rivers. I mean, these are big buildings that have lighthouses with the intent of these lighthouses were to guide, to steer, to let the mariners know, let the captains know that that is where the port is. So more often than not, you have these lighthouses. They're mostly used as guides. Before ports, mariners were often guided by fires on hilltops. It let them know that, hey, land is right there, or that something is going, that the goal of this was to improve visibility. The lighthouse functioned more as an entrance maker to ports rather than as a warning signal, which is very different. Today, when we think of lighthouses, we see them kind of as a warning signal to basically whether if you're too close to land, you're too close to port. So they're more seen as an entrance maker rather than as a warning signal, which in the case of storms or things like that, then lighthouses are usually there to further warn whether there's storms coming, or whether there's land, or you're too close to land. So that's what the lighthouses did during the early. When I'm talking about early, I'm talking about the Greek Roman era of when the lighthouses began. Now I want to talk about, there's 3 lighthouses that were very, very important in the history of lighthouses. And I want to talk about the Greek-Roman era. There's a lot of debate. According to Hermocles, which is the god of Palamedes, it was the Hermocles legend. The Palamedes of Nepaleo invented the first lighthouse, which was written documents, the solstice of Cmas, the Lighthouse of Alexandria. I'm going to go more deeper into the Lighthouse of Alexandria in a minute, because there was a lot of written documents about that lighthouse. It said that it collapsed in an earthquake in around the 3rd century BC. There was also the Cmas lighthouse of Pyrus harbor, which is in Greece. It was connected to Athens, and that was first built in the 5th century BC. Then we also have the Tower of Hercules in Spain. We also have the Dover Lighthouse in England. The Tower of Hercules, still, many of these lighthouses that I talk about are either World Heritage Sites, or they are very much still active to this day. The first one I want to talk about is the Lighthouse of Alexandria, which was made from between 280 to 247 BC. The Lighthouse of Alexandria was 330 feet overall height. It is one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. When you talk about lighthouses, they're very big structures. They're very, very well constructed. They're very well built. The intent, usually they'd have fires on top of the lighthouses. This is before today's with the lighthouses, where you have bulbs and electric lighting. Back then they had fires on these big buildings, and they would be used mostly to guide sailors. And the Lighthouse of Alexandria was one of those lighthouses that it was ultimately very huge, at 330 feet overall height. Now, while it was beautifully constructed, there were 3 earthquakes that the lighthouse had to deal with. There was 3 of them, from 956 AD to about 1323. And slowly but surely, these earthquakes would take down the Lighthouse of Alexandria, ultimately to the point where the Greeks would have to abandon the lighthouse. And sadly, the last remnants of the lighthouse was taken down in 1480, where it, unfortunately, it doesn't exist today. But the lighthouse was arguably one of the first of its kind, and is still remembered to this day. Now, the Dover Lighthouse in England, that one is near the English coast, near the English Channel. That one was arguably seen as was revolutionary in England because it was their first lighthouse. And ultimately, they did a lot of the same things similar to the Lighthouse of Alexandria. The Dover Lighthouse is, I have to see if it's still around or not, but it was very important in English history because it was the first to cover ships in England, in terms of, that was kind of the point where in England, that was a major significant lighthouse in England. Now, the last lighthouse I want to cover is actually considered a national monument in Spain. It's the Tower of Hercules, which is in Alcorana, Spain. It is a World Heritage Site in 2009. It was excuse me. It was built in the 2nd century BC. It was the 2nd tallest lighthouse in Spain, the Faro de Chaponia. And when the Romans occupied Spain, they viewed that lighthouse as the end of the earth. In many ways, it was seen as the bridge of death. Now, it still exists to this day. It's not used as a lighthouse, but it is a World Heritage Site, and it is also a national monument in Spain. And for years, the Romans would use it, and then ultimately the Spanish would use it as well. So these were 3 very, very important lighthouses that ultimately was in Europe and during the Roman era. I thought they were really, really nice. They're very big buildings too, and they lasted for a long, long time. When we return to History Now, we're going to talk about lighthouses in the United States here on History Now, here on ONTV.
Today, a new creature walks among us, terrorizing innocent citizens. Until this threat can be contained, we must all be on the lookout for the dreaded digital deadwalkers.
Dude!
They're not looking out for you.
Engage!
A public service safety message from the American Academy of Orthopedic Surgeons, who want to keep everyone well connected with strong, healthy bones.
Welcome back to History Now here on ONTV. I'm your host, Anthony Taormina. We're talking about lighthouses here. The reason why I chose lighthouses was I have one of my friends in the ONTV offices is a very big fan of lighthouses. So I went on and did some research about lighthouses and came up with a couple of some really good subjects, as we made mention with the last one. Now I want to change gears a little bit and talk about lighthouses in the United States, because there was some history that took place in terms of when the first lighthouses was built, and there's been many lighthouses to this day, whether you see them in the Atlantic Ocean, the Pacific Ocean, several rivers. You see some in the Mississippi, you see some in the Ohio River, and you see some really in the Great Lakes, where there's a lot of shipping, Mariana travel. Through everywhere you go, there is one way an area, there is a lighthouse in the United States, especially when you're near water. The first lighthouse in the United States was built in 1716 in Boston. It was called the Boston Light in Boston Harbor. At that time, the British controlled the area, and the British, along with the British colonists, created this new idea of mostly just because you would see it in England and you'd see it, and they were open to Mariana shipping, especially as the British started to really establish their control on the coastline. They needed to have some guides or some. So what they did was they built lighthouses and ended up using the fire model. They wouldn't start doing the electric model until it was till in the 1800s and then the 1900s. So they ended up, so it was built mostly on coastlines from Delaware to North Carolina. The Boston Light in Boston Harbor was probably the first one, but it was really one of the only ones that was around in the New England area. The navigation was it was really, really difficult. You had to deal with, as I said, you're really close to shore. You had choppy seas, especially if you're in the northern areas. You had to deal with colder water. Southern areas, there was warmer water, so you had to constantly try to maintain them. You had to try, and that was a challenge, even in the Roman era, where they had difficulties trying to consistently maintain and retain the lighthouses, just making sure that everything was ready, was perfect. There was also, if it rained, the fires would often go out in the lighthouses. Navigation was rather difficult. You had very choppy seas, and to be honest with you, throughout the 13 colonies, ship travel was not great. The ship travel was not tremendously smooth sailing. The weather elements were very, very different. It depended where you were at. In the northern areas, you had to deal with snow, you had to deal with constant storms, nor'easters. It was very, very difficult. And then in the southern areas, you had to deal with hurricanes and tropical storm systems. I mean, it was just not exactly the greatest of travel arrangements, especially when you were navigating to certain areas in the Atlantic Basin. There was also wood. Also, these lighthouses were mostly made of wood. Now, at this time, wood was openly readily in the 13 colonies. So there was a lot of you could do with wood. Also, there was a lot of tree bark. There was a lot of trees. So you would see the colonists would cut down trees, and they would build these lighthouses, mostly made out of wood. Wood was mostly there. So the colonists and the British ended up creating these lighthouses, mostly built on wood. But it also created a problem due to there was constant fires that was also taking place in the lighthouse. Yes, you had the fire on top, but sometimes that fire would spread. And with wood, fires usually spread very, very quickly. So as a result, masonry towers were built. Probably the oldest masonry tower that was built was in Sandy Hook, New Jersey. There's the Sandy Hook Lighthouse that was built in 1764, a year after the 7 Years' War, the French and Indian War, which they built a lighthouse, which was also wood, but also masonry towers. It is still working to this day in the United States. It is the oldest working lighthouse in the United States. Originally, it was considered the New York Lighthouse, which oversaw New York Harbor, which oversaw New York City. So originally it was called the New York Lighthouse, but ultimately it was the Sandy Hook Lighthouse because it was based in Sandy Hook, New Jersey. And during the American Revolution, the British Army and the British Navy, the British Army would use that lighthouse to detect, usually to detect to see if the reinforcements had arrived, because the British controlled the seas during the American Revolution. If you see most of the fighting that took place between the American colonists and the British during the Revolution, the majority of the fighting was done on land. Because if they went in sea, the British Army, the British Navy, was dominating the seas. So the British Navy and the British Army used the Sandy Hook Lighthouse, and it was used as a positive for the British during the war. Now, after the war, the American colonists took over the lighthouse and would use it. But it also became a constant struggle between the United States and Great Britain over control of these lighthouses, because if you see the War of 1812, there was a lot of fighting over in areas that had lighthouses control. So if you were a ship, you never knew where you were going or who controlled that lighthouse. So there was a lot of fighting in areas in the waters, and many of these waters had lighthouses, and you never knew who was truly in control. And they were often used as detection ports, as detecting enemy ships, or they were also used as to find or to see whether they were an ally or an enemy. And the lighthouses were really important, especially in wartime. Now, there were screw pile lighthouses as well. These lighthouses were used in Chesapeake Bay and the Carolina coast. The first screw pile lighthouses was the Brandywine Shoal in Delaware Bay. These lighthouses were popular after the American Civil War, when a lighthouse board approved remodeling lighthouses to be more of a screw pile rather than going more to a wood type of older, not up-to-date version of lighthouses. There was 100 of these lighthouses that were built throughout the Atlantic and Gulf coasts. So from Maine to Texas, there was about 100 lighthouses that were screw piled, but most notably in the Chesapeake Bay and the Carolina coasts. The most famous one of these screw pile lighthouses was also the Travis Shoal Lighthouse, which was located in the Chesapeake Bay. This was constructed in 1825. This became in 1999 a historical landmark, and in a way it's still used to this day, whether for tourism, for sightseeing, or they don't use it as much to navigate, but it's significant because this was one of the first screw pile lighthouses, one of the most noticeable throughout the entire United States. In 1851, Congress created the Us Lighthouse Board, which focused mostly on lighthouse maintaining, lighthouse affairs. Whether they would present it to the American government, and there was in conjunction, mostly from 1852 to 1910, the military controlled the Lighthouse Board. So the military would use the lighthouses for surveillance, for navigation, for shipping. You had to get approved to go certain areas from the military. After 1910, the board became a civilian board after more civilians started using it for civilian purposes. And then afterwards, in 1939, I think a lot of it had a lot to do with World War II. World War I, obviously, the civilian board was in control during World War I, so they worked with the American military in order to detect German boats, and in case if anything was happening on the U.S. coastline. Especially, you had that threat of U-boats that was taking place in German submarines, especially in World War I. In 1939, you had the threat of German U-boats. So they merged, the civilian board merged with the U.S. Coast Guard in 1939. So it's a combination of civilian control, and also it's now controlled by the U.S. Coast Guard. So in a way it merged, and so in the way lighthouses are now controlled by the U.S. Coast Guard and still under the control of the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, and then you had the civilians control of it, but the U.S. Coast Guard controls the lighthouses to this day. There are several lighthouses in the United States, many of which are on the Great Lakes. About 129 lighthouses are in the Great Lakes, many of which are on Lake Michigan, Lake Huron, and Lake Superior. The first lighthouse in Michigan was built in 1825, the Fort Gratiot Light, and that is still active to this day. The intent of the lighthouses in the Great Lakes was to help navigate ships to harbors and to ports, especially during storms, and to be a tracker for captains and a tracker for ships. Now, at this point, these were beginning to get electric. So you had the beginnings of the light bulb being built. And so we were slowly but surely seeing the transformation from fire and coal to more electricity-based lighthouses. And in Michigan, you could see lighthouses in Frankfort, Grand Haven, Ludington, Manistee, Benton Harbor, Caseville, Port Austin, Tawas, Keweenaw, Harlan, Harbor Beach, Gravity Shoals, and Detroit, along with many other areas throughout the Great Lakes, Traverse City. You can't go anywhere on the Great Lakes without seeing a lighthouse. But that's the goal of the lighthouses. That was their intent. Their intent was to make sure that boaters and sailors and civilians were all safe, but they're also very popular tourist attractions. You can easily go up the stairs of a lighthouse. You go up and you look out there, and you can see far into the distance of water. You could see other boats. You could see other ports, other ships. I mean, you could even see cities from these lighthouses. Lighthouses still continue to function today. Obviously, as I made mention, their goals were different, but in many ways they're still the same as they were back then, back during the Greek and Roman eras. Lighthouses will continue to be a major factor today and in the future as well. Lighthouses also help with storms, whether you could see a thunderstorm or something like that. In many ways you can't, if you live off the water, or if you live near the water, if you're shipping in the water, if you see a lighthouse, that means you know that you're close to shore. And they help guide you. And that's what lighthouses are today at present. They are guides, and in many ways they're popular tourist attractions. So all right, so that will do it for this episode of History Now. Hopefully you enjoyed the show. Have a great night, Lake Orion. See you soon. Take care.